Upon hearing this, do not panic. The alert tone means the system has triggered and is being investigated by a member of the Pullman and McEwer Emergency Response Team. Stand by and wait for announcements over the PA system or by staff members. If the evacuation tone sounds,
evacuate as directed. Evacuate as directed.
you will be advised by announcement over the PA system and by staff members that an evacuation is in effect. Follow the direction of the fire warden and hotel staff to your nearest evacuation route and move to your assembly point. Our staff member is now going to point out to you your nearest fire exits. This hotel comprises of 2 separate buildings and therefore 2 separate emergency assembly area points. The Pullman Tower Assembly Area is located under the Turbot Street overpass at the corner of Turbot and Roma Street. The McEwer Tower Assembly Area is located in front of the Sereno Russo building, 20 metres up Ann Street. At the emergency assembly areas, the fire warden will account for you and you will be informed when to return to the hotel. Thank you for your attention and enjoy your event.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Sunny Yung. I work in Telstra in Australia. I'm a senior technology specialist here, and my function is basically doing IPv6 deployments in Australia. We have some very distinguished guests today in our panel for the IPv6 plenary, but we just want to do some housekeeping first. First is phones to silent, please, if you can. File escapes are directly behind you. And questions for microphones for questions are just on either side here. So if you have questions, just come up. I'm not sure we have a roaming mic, so please come up if you've got any questions. We have 4 distinguished speakers today. I'll introduce them as we get to each presentation, but first here is Jeff Houston from APNIC, Chief Scientist, and we have John Berg from Cable Labs. We have John Brzozowski, who's on Skype today, who cannot be here, unfortunately, due to some unforeseen circumstances. Really wants to be here, but unfortunately he couldn't make it today. So he's on Skype with us. And Eric Vinke from Cisco Systems, Distinguished Systems Engineer. So please give him a warm welcome first. So amongst the think tank of the internet today, so we're very privileged. So my role was to try and ask some questions and try and get the session moving along. So today's presentations are going to be on the topic of dual stacking. So what it is about is IPv6 deployment is steadily increasing and the degree of its implementation is varying greatly at the moment. The ratio of v6 ready end users increases sharply once a network deploys IPv6 in their production service networks, or appears to be. So we're going to have a closer look at what some of these results are possibly looking like at the moment. As networks deploy v6, it will collectively create economies of scale for IPv6. So this is great for operators as v4's usage slowly appreciates, but is it really the case? And momentum possibly would gather for further v6 deployments. There are many dimensions within the field, and researchers and network operators who have been monitoring the performance differences between v6 and v4. Networks will share some data with you today and share observations and some analysis. Some questions you might want to ask today for yourself. Is any significant performances different between v4 and v6 deployments? And what should we know about performance-related issues, perhaps as an operator or as a business operator? So we'll go to our first speaker today for presentations. Jeff is the Chief Scientist at APNIC. He's authored books, papers, and columns on IP technology and led the initial construction of the internet in Australia in the late 1980s as part of the Australian Academic and Research Network. He's also ex-Telstra. Active member of IETF, chairing 2 working groups and participate on the board and executive council of APNIC. And we're privileged to hear his research on v6 and v4 performance comparison, and Jeff will look into the topic from a connection reliability and RTT measurements point of view. I think that's all I had. Yep. Okay, over to you, Jeff.
So I'll just do it from here?
Yep.
Doing it sitting down. By the way, if there are some Telstra folk who remember David Woodgate, he just had a daughter this morning. Yes, I know, he's very pleased. And some of you also might remember David from Telstra. Yes, IPv6, IPv4 measurement. Some time ago, Microsoft decided that they would push out their version of Windows with IPv6 on all the time. And the way they did this was that if there wasn't a native v6 connection to the machine, it tunnelled across the v4 infrastructure. If you had a native IPv4 address, it used a 6-to-4 tunnelling approach, and if you're behind a NAT and it sensed it through, it used Teredo. The problem was that tunnelling is horrible. And when we actually came to look at the performance levels out of this, Teredo failed as much as it succeeded, 50% failure rate. And even 6-to-4 failed about 20% of the time. And the real question was, do you hate your customers? Because when you subject them to that kind of performance penalty, where it was taking up to 20 seconds to fail, then all of a sudden turning on v6 was an exercise in acute frustration. So that mythology that v6 is horrible has persisted. And a lot of folk now are going, well, I'm not going to do v6 here, I'm going to wait till it gets better. So let's look at some stats about where v6 actually is today. Now, what I like to do is be you for all of you as much as I can. In other words, look at the internet from the experience of the end user. And we came across this idea of using ads. In the RIPE NCC region, they actually use end probes, these Atlas probes. But we kind of thought we can actually measure more and measure harder if we use someone else's ad network to deliver tests that you yourselves run and report back to the sort of service point. So what we do is we test 300, 400, 500,000 ads per day. And what they do is they fetch a really tiny thing, a 1x1 pixel. You never see it, it's invisible, happens in the background. We packet dump everything because all of these pixels come from our servers. The names are not cached. Everything happens at the server. So I see the DNS and I see the resultant fetch of that pixel. So now I've got some very interesting views of what everybody does. And I'd like to break it down into a couple of things. And the first one is, how reliable is v6? Do connection attempts work? Now, the way this pixel is served is TCP. You all know TCP, don't you? Yes, we all know TCP. And TCP uses an initial handshake down in the kernel. You can't stop it. Even if you leave a web page, that handshake will complete because that's a kernel directive. And the way it works is it's three-way. If you're the user and I'm the server, you send me an opening packet, SYN, which is basically hello. I respond back going, well, great to meet you. Here's my magic number, SYNAC. Then you send me an ACK. And then we've got a connection that's open and both of us can speak. And typically you say, get me this 1x1 pixel, and I go, here's a pixel, and we all go from there. But let's just focus in on connection reliability. What if you can talk, but you can't hear? What if you can send me the SYN, and I'll send you back a SYNAC, but you can't hear that SYNAC? It just doesn't get to you. You never send me an ACK. So I start to have a look through my data and go, how many naked SYNs do I see? That was a joke, by the way. How many naked SYNs do I see? And can I compare v4 and v6? Well, I can, and these are the numbers every day up until a couple of days ago. v4 is not perfect. 0.1% of connections fail. And it's actually getting higher over time. What is that? That's the background crap in v4 of folk doing SYN scanning. How do I know if an address is live? I send it a SYN. It's live if it gives me back a SYNAC. I never complete the connection. That's just someone scanning the entire v4 space, and a lot of folks scan the entire v4 space to count live addresses. And sometimes I'm the victim of a DDoS attack, and those are the green spikes. So the background control point in v4 is around 0.1%. I don't expect to see address walking in 6. You can't walk v6 addresses at random. And I'm not using FFFE addresses. I'm actually using randomised addresses for these servers. So I don't expect to see that. v6 should be better than 4. The red line says it's not. It's around 1.5, 1.8% don't work. So 1 in 50, 1 in 60, 1 in 70 don't actually complete the connection. It's amazingly consistent, isn't it? It's not getting any better. That red line is almost horizontal, and it's higher than I think you're comfortable with. It's higher than any of us are comfortable with. So that's not the best of news, and that just simply puts it in. What's going on? Most of the internet lives behind filters and firewalls. And if you're at home, that filter and firewall was something you bought at Dick Smith or wherever else, and you haven't programmed it. You're just relying on the vendor. And the vendor has pre-packaged some rules. And my guess is that for certain types of equipment, the pre-packaged rule is v6 does not exist, incoming v6 packets are evil, I'm going to kill them. And that's, I think, what's going on there, that the end devices are just being filtered out. Because that has been the problem in most of the tunnelling we saw earlier, edge devices. And I think this is very similar. We're seeing an awful lot of edge devices that allow v6 out, but won't let it back in. Where are they? Because I can see your AS. I know which addresses are failing. And this is kind of interesting. That's the failure rate. Sometimes it's structural in the ISP itself. So if anyone knows in Indonesia, Core Media Tech, they've got these filters running at the ISP level. They should take them out. Over in New Zealand, a 77% failure rate, coming second from DTS. And you can read it as much as I can. It is amazing that some of these folk, it is quite high. Others reflect, I think, something else. And I'm not sure what's going on in level 3, but that's an awfully high failure rate. So if you see your own network there, come and talk to me, or better still, go and look at these networks that you're running and understand why you're living with an abysmally high failure rate, because it should not be happening. And this is where I've actually got the highest number of samples. Some folk do it right. Look at Janet, 0.97%. That's normal. Google, 0.06% failure rate. That's normal. The Romanians, who rolled out a massive IPv6 network in April 2000 and something, 3.48%. So yes, some folk can do it, but some folk don't. This is the Asia Pacific nets. Have a look at the slide pack online. See yourself there. Do something about it. The other part is performance. Is v6 faster than v4 or not? Because the other thing I can actually do is on the successful connection attempts, I can measure the elapsed time between receiving the SYN and receiving the ACK. That's one round trip time. And if you're coming to me in 4 and in 6, I can compare those 2 round trip times and see which is faster. So that's exactly what I've done. And in this graph, here's the distribution of sample points. And this was done in July 2012. So those points over to the right, v4 was faster than 6. Those points to the left, v6 was faster than 4. And it's basically 1.5 times faster, twice as fast, etc. Here's a more recent one, and it's shifted. I thought, gee, that's amazing. v6 is now appreciably faster than 4. Is this isolated? So then I decided to measure every single month, because it's just data and it's just a computer and you can. And that's the aggregate and average across all of that period from mid-2012 until this last month. And the blue line, you might say that sort of says that on the whole, the peak is slightly to the left of centre. v6 is slightly faster than 4 for most folk. Oddly enough, the area under the curve says no, it's about the same. So is v4 faster than v6? Not really. Is v6 faster than v4? Not really. It's about the same, which is good news. So as far as I can see, the only thing that's really getting in the way now, there's an awful lot of middleware that intercepts v4, web proxies, etc., and I think that adds time. And that's the reason why I think there's that slight skew over one side or the other. And I think that's the end of my slide pack from there. So the issue is for connection attempts, there's still an awful lot of edge consumerware that blocks incoming 6. That's bad. And there are some ISPs that seem to operate with a firewall policy at the ISP level that blocks incoming v6. That's bad. Why is it bad? If you're running Windows and you think you can make a connection in v6, and you can't, your machine will take 20 seconds to figure out that it can't. So every single time someone tries 6 and fails, they get the spinning beach ball of death or whatever happens on Windows for 20 seconds. So if you're filtering incoming v6, it's not a victimless crime. You really are making life hell for your users. Don't do it. On the RTTs, the laws of physics are taking over. It's not that v6 is looping packets around the planet. It's that v6 is using much the same paths as v4, as far as I can tell. Performance, much the same. The only subtle change is I suspect there's some middleware packet trapping in 4 that doesn't happen in 6. So maybe that's as good a reason as any to try and move away from getting your packets mangled and intercepted in 4. Thanks.
Thanks. First of all, is there any questions on from the floor? Okay, I've got a couple of questions for Jeff just very quickly, and for the panel as well if you want to participate. And the first one is, so we're saying that the v6 connection failure rates are due to people denying internet originating traffic and inadvertently blocking the legitimate acknowledgements. So do you, in your professional opinion, do you think these will go up in the long term?
We have a problem that is very similar to the digital television set-top box problem, that folk buy, particularly DSL modems, as a once and forever purchase. And they typically won't buy another until they change ISPs or some other massive event in their life. It's not that you go out and buy a new modem every week. And it's not that you even upgrade the firmware every week. Most folk use a buy and forget. And so this problem I expect to have a very, very long tail to it, Sonny. And, you know, quite frankly, reaching out to folk who have this problem, we might have to think of ways to actually get in touch with them or somehow reach through the wire going, you know, you're my customer and I love you dearly, but you really are putting your foot in your mouth here. We've got to help you get out of this. And certainly we're looking with a number of providers of ways to using this measurement technique to isolate folk who actually are encountering this kind of problem and to figure out how we can sort of offer advice back in going, your internet could be a lot better if you remove that particular filtering rule from your equipment. We're here to help. Let's see what we can do.
We have John Brzozowski on Skype at the moment. I'm wondering if John has any comments on this topic as well, on this question.
Sonny, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, yes.
So I was just going to attempt to raise my hand on the Adobe Connect, but you beat me to the punch. So you know, it's kind of funny. Jeff brings up a very good point about you know, software upgrades. One of the things that we can confirm as a large service provider is that that's a huge matter and has a dramatic effect on customer experience. One of the things that we've done over the years is we've kind of helped our customers out from that perspective and handle, in many cases, interacting with our software, our device vendors and orchestrating those upgrades on behalf of our customers. Because Jeff is exactly right. You know, some of these devices that we purchase for, you know, $25 US, they last a lifetime. And without the TLC in the form of, you know, software updates or configuration updates, not only does it affect performance, but it also, in many cases, affects the customer's ability to enjoy v6, period. So one of the things that I often attest our growing v6 deployment to is the fact that we can organize these firmware updates and push them out remotely for the benefit of our customers.
Thank you, John, for your contribution there. Jeff, the other part of your presentation is about the round trip time. We all know that V4 and V6 traffic can take completely different paths, obviously. So how much dependence is there on a server or client deployments and actual V6 support is there to influence these results? And we want to see these results, the figures move towards the left, obviously. But what can we do to increase that?
I think one of the issues that's now becoming prevalent, if you've ever looked inside content distribution networks, is now we're finding that there's an awful lot of geolocation information that hangs around V4. And when you ask for your favourite content through something like Akamai or any other cloud-based service, the address that you get back for the location of that service depends on where you are. It geolocates you, the questioner, and gives you an answer that is optimal in terms of here's the closest service to where you are. But if you ask the same question in 6 to almost the same DNS bank, it's not clear that you're going to get an optimal answer yet, because a lot of those geolocation databases actually aren't configured up with complete 6 information. That'll be one of the key things here, to do this sort of content distribution in 6 at the same level of quality and accuracy as we've managed to do in 4. And I think that would make an appreciable difference. The rest of this, it's just business, and that's where it's meant to be. Previously, V6 was toy. No one paid for it. The peering connections were arbitrary, the tunnels were everywhere, performance was a joke, and you could bounce V6 packets across a continent without even knowing what was going on. I don't see much of that anymore. I'm not sure anyone does. What we're seeing is that the 4 paths and the 6 paths are now roughly the same. And routing tends to go to the lowest cost path, which coincidentally typically means lowest delay, because looping packets around the planet costs everybody. Typically you try and avoid that. So in general, V6 is now business, and because it's business, the routing is now sane. The next point to look at is actually in the content distribution networks and the geo-lock that's hidden inside there.
Thank you, Jeff. Are there any comments from the rest of the panel on this topic?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely, please, from the floor.
Yeah, I think I agree the Jeff presentation, of course, based on the technical point of view. And the issue, the question I'd like to ask is, we also saw the IPv6 actually somehow is growing by a percentage or whatever. And I think it's an interesting thing is, even we have such value, it seems like the operator still can run it, and the user still can accept it. And if they are not accepted, they were going to complain to the operator, and the operator have to do something about it. It seems like even have such of the high percentage of the value, is that mean the users accept the situation? And of course, the operator, just like you say, this is a technical failure, and the operator were going to improve or something to resolve it. But I'm coming back to see the market or looking at the traffic developments. It seems like the user can accept such of the high percentage of failure. Is that right?
Yes, and the reason why they tend to accept such a high percentage of failure is that for many of these folk, they don't go to many V6 or dual-stacked sites. And so they never are exposed to the problem until they move to those sites. I put up the top 25 failure ISPs deliberately, because if you're listed, you really should do something about this, because quite frankly, your users who are going to V6 sites are having a huge problem. Particularly if they're using Windows, it's going to take 20 seconds to fall back to V4. So the world will still work, but it'll look like it's driven by a horse. And that's the issue.
Yeah,
so, yes.
Yeah. I agree with that. And if such a high percentage of value, and if the IPv6 traffic keep growing in the 4 to 6 or 6 to 4 is continue to grow, that would make the situation even worse, and eventually the user cannot accept that, and the operator have to face it to resolve it.
Well, you're kind of thinking that the user knows that the internet isn't having a bad hair day, they're having a bad hair day with 6. And most of the time, most users go, the internet is terribly slow today, let's go shopping.
Yeah.
You know, they don't diagnose the problem, they just see the artifact. And that's kind of the next level of tender-loving care, as John has said. It's really up to the ISP, I think, to reach through going, I think I can help you.
Yeah.
I think I can make your experience what it should be. The internet isn't having a bad hair day. You're running a $25 modem that's blocking 6. That's bad.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But just to add on your side, Jeff is measuring TCP connection. The user is using a browser, and most of the browser use, as you know, API board, where basically they start at the same time, V6 session and V4 session, and if the V6 session is good and faster than the V4, they keep using V6. If the V6 session does not complete, sync per sec, right, they fall back to V4. So from the user perspective, the internet does not appear as broken, which is, I think, even worse somehow, because if the user does not complain, the service provider will not fix it, right? So that's a short-term move, but pretty good move.
But let's go back to what I'm saying in the second part. If this value is growing, and that means the delay is longer, eventually user cannot accept that.
No, because they will fall back in the case of API Vault to V4, like many years
Well,
before.
not really. Yes and no. Yes and no.
There are 4 major browsers out there, actually 3, and one that is a sentimental favourite. There's Chrome, there's Firefox, there's Explorer, and my sentimental favourite, Safari. Chrome does happy eyeballs, irrespective of the platform. If it sees 4 and 6, it will try both in parallel, and the 6 problems get masked. Same with Firefox, same with Safari. But if you're some poor unfortunate person like 75% of the world running Explorer on Windows, unfortunately there is no happy eyeballs.
Yeah.
And then you lose, unfortunately. And it's really a message sort of flung out to Microsoft going, we're all suffering here. Maybe happy eyeballs does mask a problem, but it solves a problem as well. And certainly my plea to Microsoft, I saw him there, I think he's
To
gone.
solve it.
Is happy eyeballs really is a good idea. It really is a good idea. It does mask a problem, but on the whole, it's positive, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll take one more question, and then we'll have to move on to the next slides. So,
Thank Sanjay from APNIC. This question is actually probably targeted to you, Sunny, but triggered by Jeff's comment about the path between V4 and V6, pretty much the same. I did some random testing whenever I travel. When I get a V6, I just do a simple trace route, basically trying to see, you know, how many hops are there compared to V4. And actually, particularly in Telstra, because, you know, sometimes my network is Telstra is in the path, you actually have a shorter IPv6 path compared to your IPv4. So is that not an opportunity for the operators as well to, while deploying IPv6, they also try to make paths shorter? Thanks.
I think the best way to describe it is that a lot of operators, including myself, we try to build an environment as best as possible to bypass the legacy environment as much as possible. So maybe some of the results that you see in these presentations is the results of others in other operators who are trying to attempt the same thing. So that's how I see it at the moment.
There is a lot of traffic engineering in V4, Sanjay, because certainly the bulk of most folks' traffic is still in V4. And so what you find is prefix advertising engineering, you know, moving the traffic around, happens more in 4 than 6. And what you might find is that some cases, paths that are, if you will, mainstream paths in 6 have been splayed out onto alternates in 4, and sometimes your 4 tracks move what seems like further hops simply because there's more traffic to splay across more links. And that's currently what we're seeing. At some point, the V6 traffic gets to the point, you've got a traffic engineer in 6 as well, and you will again get back into these experiences of everything goes down these paths.
Yeah, one last and final one, and
Yeah,
we're going to move
so,
on.
Tony Hayne, a quick comment back to Jeff's point. I think one of the things you overlooked in your analysis is you're actually doing ads, right? And so you're measuring ads, and from a end user perspective, quite often, failure of the ad to load is actually a win. And so it's not so much, you know, yes, some percentage of those ads are not going to load. The users might actually think that's a win because now the page, they're ready to move on to the next thing faster.
So Tony, I explicitly look at the TCP handshake. And the reason why I look at the TCP handshake is that the signaling coming from the app, the browser, down into the TCP driver is basically an open call. The three-way handshake is actually a kernel state at that point.
No.
It's very difficult for the app to interrupt that handshake. And that's what I'm relying for in terms of the reliability. I don't care whether they load the pixel. That doesn't matter. I'm actually looking at what percentage of folk fail to complete a handshake they start.
I understand. That wasn't my point. It was more back to the other discussion in terms of why aren't people complaining?
Oh.
And in fact, probably they're not complaining because the thing that didn't happen was an ad, and maybe that's actually a win.
Well, the internet's magic, so no one complains about that. Yeah.
Okay, we'll move on to our next speaker. John Berg is from Cable Labs, lead engineer there, and a strong background in DOCSIS, voice over IP, SIP, IPv6, and home networking deployments. He's been a regular blogger with many white papers and technical reports advocating V6 adoption and migration, and actively engaged in standards and testing for V6 and also public Wi-Fi, I believe, as well. John has engaged a lot of IPv6 related technical activities, such as hosting more than 20 IPv6 related test events at Cable Labs, studying optimization of multi-router and multi-home networks on IPv6, and also authoring a lot of white papers, technical reports as well. So John, over to your presentation.
Thank you. So the focus of my presentations today is going to be more on IPv6 and IPv4 performance. It's become a hot topic now, collecting IP metrics, various things that are going on with, you know, over-the-top services like Netflix has kind of driven that in recent months. And then there's a lot of hype about, is IPv6 really faster than IPv4? So most of the data I'm going to be talking about today are actual test results we've done at Cable Labs. So is my slide really projecting correctly there? I don't see the whole thing. Okay. It's not showing up here. Anyway, just a little bit of background on Cable Labs. For those of you who don't know Cable Labs, we're really the R&D arm of the cable industry, and we basically support North America, Europe, now parts of China and Asia as well. We've been testing IPv6 since 2009, actually 2007 if you count early days of DOCSIS IPv6 support. But most of our testing is orchestrated around testing events that we plan and execute with our members and vendors. We call these interops. And we've probably run about 20 or 25 IPv6 related events since 2009. What we've seen is this kind of, you know, nagging, subtle idea that there is some performance advantage for IPv6 over IPv4. So the results I'm going to be presenting today are really around this IP metrics kind of notion. And the two sets of data that I have to go through are first some real performance data that we collected and analyzed with one of our member operators, and then some performance testing we did at Cable Labs in our lab, both for native IPv6 and testing IPv4 with 1 layer and 2 layers of NAT. So we'll start with the real data. We worked with our MSO who very diligently and methodically collected actually over 1.5 million data records for IPv4 and IPv6. We collaborated with them on the analysis of this data. Metrics collected were basically the average round trip time, going to a variety of IPv4 and IPv6 websites. So these were roughly 25, 30 of the most popular websites. Then from there, we took the raw data, generated some statistics, mean, median, standard deviation, all the usual statistics you crank out of, a boatload of data. And the way the data was collected is measurement agents or probes were placed in 10 hubs selected around the continental US. These are placed in the backbone POPs. And then every hour randomized latency checks were run from each of the hubs to all the websites on the list. And as Jeff was talking about, the RTT interval that's used as the measurement here is just the completion of the TCP handshake between the client and the server. So this next slide, this shows you the locations of the hubs throughout the continental United States. And I guess the point of this is it pretty much covers the full east to west coast of the entire continental US. The idea being a lot of data points, cover as much of the whole country as possible, eliminate skewed data results for having too narrow a region, too few hops maybe, or something that may skew the results in terms of how the data was collected. So let's look at the actual data that some of the results data that we gathered here and what the message is. So what I've done in this next set of slides is selectively take out some examples of some of the results we gathered from specific websites. And I chose one statistics. In this case, it was the average mean round trip time. And I kind of plotted these out on bar graphs so we can kind of see, is IPv6 really faster overall? So in this example, we've collected months of data on, going to apple.com in IPv4 and IPv6. And here it's clear there's definitely a performance advantage in IPv6. It's a millisecond or so, but it's measurable. Similarly, going to Wikipedia, we saw a similar performance advantage, millisecond or more. Still measurably faster than IPv4. But now's where it gets interesting. Because in cases where we went to Facebook, on average, there was really no difference in the performance between V4 and V6. We're really looking at 0.03 millisecond difference, not really noticeable. Similarly, going to Netflix, we saw similar results, nearly identical for V4 or for V6. Now, I should call out here, because there's some sensitivity for results we report about Netflix for things going on in the industry and things like that. So this is not representative of Netflix performance. It's just simply testing we've done out of our own data probes to see, can we really detect a difference between V4 and V6? But as you see, very similar for this particular website. Now, here's where things get crazy. When we went to Yahoo, we observed that, hey, what happened? Now all of a sudden, V4 is the winner, and in this case, by nearly 25 milliseconds. Noticeable difference. Similarly, going to YouTube, IPv4 wins again. So what do we make out of these results? Well, here's where the hair pulling can start. Have I wasted the last 6 months of my life looking at this data? I think I think of it sometimes as the brilliant mind moment. Do I just take all the files, books, notebooks I've collected and just burn it in the garage and move on to something else? Well, no, that's not the answer. The next slide here really brings us back in to realize, hey, there's probably something really going on here. There's logical and mathematical reasons to believe IPv6 is faster. And when we look at the aggregate view of all this data we collected, take everything in one perspective, and on this box plot that I have on the slide, what this represents is the little red square in the center is our median average round trip time plotted out for all the test results, all the websites that were visited. You can see there's clearly a performance advantage just looking at the median score. But what's even more interesting about this is if you plot this out in the 25 to 75 percentile and ignore the the random hits that are way out of range, either on the low or high end, there's definitely a narrower range of results for IPv6. So this is what makes me say, hey, this is still interesting. There's something to be looked at here, and it's worth further investigation to get to the bottom of this. So let's look at some actual lab testing that we've done at Cable Labs now. This is the lab testing we did in the scope of one interop that we did about a year ago. And this isn't rocket science. It's just a simple test setup in our lab. It's not going out to the public internet. It doesn't go on to any operator real network. We basically set up an end-to-end cable environment here where the top box is basically the head-end environment with CMTS switch going out to a test server. The bottom box is what really kind of amounts to a typical home network today. So cable modem with some home edge router, an internet router or internal router behind that, secondary router, whatever you want to call that. And then a NAT enabled on the edge router, and from the test PC we would basically run ping tests with NAT either enabled or disabled on the secondary internal router. So this kind of just puts it in a pure lab environment. We eliminate the path differences of V4 to V6, and there's no issues with traffic engineering or any real world network kind of impairments that would affect results. So let's see what happened. So in the case of one layer of NAT, well, wow, this is great. This is kind of what we wanted to see happen. IPv6 is noticeably better. If you look at mean, median, standard deviation, all the general statistics, it looks great. It's, wow, maybe IPv6 is faster. But what would account for that? So now there's a reason. Maybe NAT is responsible for slower IP performance. We don't know. We're thinking right now. But before we get too excited, let's look at what happened when we added the second layer of NAT on that internal router. Well, what happened? Now, whereas we saw with one layer of NAT, there was a definite advantage shown for V6. Now, two NATs we've introduced, results are pretty much on an even keel. IPv4 still has a higher instance of variability, but IPv6 performed better than half the time. So now the other questions are raised. Could NAT performance vary per device? And then you have to think, if you're going to deploy carrier grade NAT, is this going to be a factor in what the user experience is going to be? So how do we interpret this data, and how do we explain these results? Well, we still think, based on all the results we've looked at, there is some subtle IPv6 performance advantage here. There's definitely something to look at and study further. But right now, there's just more questions than answers. For example, does NAT performance vary across IPv4 platforms? Is hop count a factor for V4 versus V6? How do the network effects such as tunnels, traffic engineering, congestion, how does that factor in? And then looking ahead a little bit, what about content provider transition strategies for IPv6? How is that going to play in? So these are all characterized as questions because they are. We don't have the answers today. And let's face it, bottom line is we don't really have the tools to measure all the points in the network where latency can appear. As a user, you can go out and install a third-party speed server or speed test thing on your software on your home PC or laptop. You can get some kind of data back that tells you what you think your performance is and how that relates to the service you're paying for. The bottom line is you're not really measuring where the true points of latency may be in the network. So you're looking at the access network or the home network only. What about the core network or the backbone network? So the message is we need better tools to analyze these things and correlate the points in the network where latency can occur. Bottom line, we need to do further research. So in conclusion, just wanted to mention an initiative that Cable Labs is just kicking off now. It's a new project called Clipper, stands for Cable Labs IP Performance Evaluation and Reporting. And this is just in its infancy, just getting off the ground, but we've been working with a couple of MSOs to kind of get this kicked off. The intention here is to align with a lot of the current work going on in the IETF and Broadband Forum, and basically get MSOs on a common test platform. And then we need to look at things like gathering data on, jitter, delay, packet loss, throughput, DNS response time in the network at various data points, instead of just the simple tools that speed tests do today, such as just give you a response time, essentially. We need better correlation of these speed test tools between the home router and wireless devices, because that's where we see a lot of the disparity today. So the basic message here and the recommendation is we need systematic performance metric collection, and it should take the differences between IPv4 and IPv6 into account. Essentially, we need to test both using these tools, and then perhaps we can answer the question, is IPv6 really faster? And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And we really appreciate you didn't burn your books in the end. So we've got more research to do, it looks like. Well, I'll just put one question very quickly, and then we'll have to move on. But in a fixed network, the home routers are usually provided with a public IPv4 address today. And as we face V4 depletion, some operators will decide to use NAT44 for the first time. In relation to your research so far, what's your view on carriers who may want to extend their private use and start installing NAT44 all of a sudden in their environment?
So we haven't been a big fan of NAT44 or NAT444 ever since we did some testing on it about 3 years ago, where we found some main deficiencies. So I think the obvious thing is we know some things break. When you go through a NATed environment, for example, some gaming platforms break when you go through a NAT. A lot of SIP applications break when you go through a NAT. There's been some strides to fix some of those things. I think Microsoft fixed Xbox a while back, so it works a little better now. But my big issue with NAT, or NAT44 or 444 in general, is not so much that, but realistically the number of subscribers you can put behind a single IP address in the network. So CGN vendors will tell you, oh, yeah, there's no problem. You can put 10,000 users back there. You can extend the life of v4 indefinitely. To me, I call it the, the avoidance technology. It's avoid the migration to IPv6. And the main issue I have with it is it's actually the port consumption from the basic home user today. So we don't have, you know, 3, 4, 5 years ago, there was a single PC in a household and one person using it. Today with multi-users and multi-connected devices in the home, it's surprising the number of ports that can be consumed by one household. I won't go into a lot of more detail about that, but basically, rather than the 10,000 users that you'd be led to believe can really function adequately behind one IP address on a NAT, what we've at Cable Labs have been advising operators is the realistic number is more like 200, based on the number of ports that can be consumed just on going to one website and streaming a video. So that's not very cost effective for operators to deploy.
Deploy NAT, yeah.
May I add a few things? So there's one thing regarding numbers of ports, and I agree, right? I mean, we should not do CGN or whatever, right? Point taken. What I've seen recently is that applications like Facebook or Google Maps are now using a protocol called Speedy to basically multiplex multiple TCP sessions on a single one. You remember the entity research, the Google Maps, which was broken, doesn't break anymore, simply because it's using a single TCP connection, multiplexing multiple HTTP sessions on it. Anyway, that's the best thing to do. To the point of costing money, my little country, Belgium, we have a memorandum of understanding between the cyber police, the service providers, and the regulator that fixed 1 to 16, meaning one IPv4 address can be shared by maximum 16 subscribers, which I think explained the cost of CGN and the reason why Belgium is leading in IPv6 deployment. The later is a guess, right? For sure. I can only guess, but there is a link most probably there.
So maybe a government intervention might be an idea to try and push IPv6, it sounds like.
That's correct.
Okay, we'll move on to the next presenter. He's online on Skype, I believe. John Brzezowski from Comcast, Chief Architect IPv6. He's an expert at v6 deployment and v4, v6 coexistence. He's authored multiple RFCs and currently co-chairs the v6 Ops Working Group and an instrumental contributor in both. He's offline at the moment, so we'll move on to Eric, temporarily. So it's unfortunate. We'll come back to John as soon as possible. Eric's from Cisco Systems, Distinguished Systems Engineer, Co-Chairman at V6 Council in Belgium, Professor at the University of Liège, I believe, is that how you pronounce it? Okay, recently co-authored a book on V6 security and has authored multiple RFCs as well. And Eric's contributed to the internet technical community with many v6 activities, including deployment status via the v6 deployment aggregation status website, contributing v6 standard development at IETF, and also engaged with various universities as a visiting professor as well. And what Eric's going to do is share with us some of his results from research one of his PhD students have been doing on v6 and v4 performance comparison, focus on potential difference of server locations around the world. So it's still evolving, I believe, and it's cutting edge content you're seeing today. So over to you, Eric.
Yeah. So it's mainly presenting the work done by Marcel, which is coming from the École Polytechnique in Paris, where I was basically mentoring him there. So it's pretty much the same thing as the previous speakers, except that we are using a couple of probes, and we are using, again, TCP jump on the round trip time, pretty much like everyone, from different locations worldwide. And where we go is not 20 websites, but we go to the Alexa web list, which is the top 1 million website. We only go to the dual stack them, and we go it again and again and again. That's basically what we have done for a couple of months. So you can see here the numbers of servers we were probing. So for instance, in blue, we see that in the US and part of the Europe, there's the main servers we were probing. While, for instance, in this country, Australia, we were only probing every run between 10 and 50. It's simply because there's only 10 and 50 dual stack servers in the Alexa web list based in Australia. Okay, that's simply the reason. That's no segregation here or whatever. That's basically the same thing as presented before. We have the same result. The procedures were slightly different, but I think we all do the same. It's identical V4 and V6. There is not a big difference. You can guess from there, it's slightly slower in V6 than in V4 even. Okay, I'll show some example there. We made other tests regarding the IS path using road view that I cannot present here for sake of time. One thing we've seen as an example, because we were looking for example, going back one slide, you know, on the very far end, where IPv6 was either much faster or much slower. And we focus on those one. And we discovered what we call the hurricane electric effect. Hurricane electric has been very active in IPv6 for many years. So, for instance, if we look from our probe, it was in Singapore, because we have got probe in Singapore, in Australia, one in France, one in Canada, one in the US. We try very much to get dual stack probes in Africa and Latin America, but we were unable to have a VM in those continents which were dual stack. But come back from the Singapore probes. If they want to reach a server which is in France, look about the path. The green is in IPv6, using Hurricane Electric. The red one is using other providers, is going basically the long way. Okay? I can tell you when I will be flying back on a Saturday morning, I will follow the green path. I want to be back home early. I will not be flying the red path. So we've seen this, and that's a reason why maybe IPv6 in some cases is better, because Hurricane Electric has done a lot of things there. It's a kind of a new one as well. And that's basically from Singapore. You see in red, this is IPv4. It's much take longer compared to the green distribution, which is over IPv6, so taking the short path. Another one, which is quite funny, it was basically, it says in the case where IPv6 is bad. If you look about Maryland, the probe we are running is from this part. And we were going to basically a US government website, which is also in Maryland. And if you look, we are going through Texas just to reach something which is next door. Again, this is bad BGP routing, and nothing can surprise us, but it's basically two cases that are kind of extreme and quite interesting to show, basically. And that's basically what you are seeing, no more on the graph, but typically the response time, of course, varies between V6 and V4 here, and is V6 the loser in this case. So my point is that we see a lot of time when there is discrepancies, we see discrepancies in BGP path. And I said we explore them by using route view. It's not there, but we see differences, for instance, in the AS path, but also in the hop count. Most probably as well because people are using tunnels. And of course, if you're using hop count, you can cross multiple routers across the tunnel. It only appears as a single one. Okay, so we see a difference there that can explain a lot. So BGP is basically the thing to fix. It's nothing bad or good in IPv6 per se. It's we need to clean up the routing table, I would say.
How do we change the way we use the AS paths then for BGP routing to try and optimize the BGP path for V6 in the future?
So usually what I say, for multiple reasons, for operational reasons basically, you need to have the same situation in V4 as in V6. It's for the security policy, for instance, but also for the routing policy. So now how to do it, as far as I know, there is no automated tool, but running very simple tool based on route view and multiple looking glass, you can see differences. Now, who will take time to fix this? It's a big question. Now, I have no answer, basically, because it costs money to fix the BGP peering.
Now, there's a lot of new technologies that's also in the discussions in this forum during the conference. We're looking at technologies like SDN, for example. Is that something that might solve this problem in the future, do you think?
Honestly, if you think about SDN across the internet, except if, and this is starting a joke, right? Except if the SDN controller is managed by the NSA, then we get the same paths before V6 all going through Maryland so that NSA can be sniffing the traffic. But honestly, no, SDN maybe within an AS, most probably within an enterprise in some very specific niche. I'm not a big SDN believer, to be honest. It's simply move the complexity somewhere else.
Are there any questions on the floor for Eric? Any comments from the panel?
Part of the issue that you look at in BGP, Eric, I think is actually an artifact of what many vendors do with BGP. You can actually make the V4 and V6 paths within an AS totally congruent if you're allowed to route IBGP V6 using V4 next hops. But for some reason, everyone thinks that crossing the protocol beams is heresy, and we're not allowed to do that. So we actually have to set up distinct V4 and V6 routing regimes in the internal routing. And then, yes, paths tend to vary, the traffic splays, and you get these kinds of differences. Oddly enough, if we're actually allowed to go, look, the major job of an ISP is to get rid of packets. And it doesn't matter what the token is you use to nominate the exit point. You could force the beams together and use one routing system, but most of us don't, because we're somehow comfortable that V4 routing is different from V6, so we run two routing universes. Everyone does it. Is it good? Is it bad? I don't know. Does it make some differences? Yes, it does. And, you know, that's, I suppose, where the thinking on my side has got to at this point. Yes, it's different. I'm not really sure if I could claim that it's a better or worse approach, but yes, we run two routing universes at the moment.
Yeah.
Are there any questions from the floor? John's back online, so John, can you hear us?
Sure can. Can you hear me?
Excellent. Yes, we can. I'll do a quick introduction. John has been the driving force behind Comcast V6 transition and deployment since 2005. And Comcast's IPv6 readiness level among end users have been showing very rapid growth since July 2013. And it's about 25% now, and they're one of the highest levels among services providers in the world. We're very happy to have his input. It's very hard to get operators to speak in these forums. So we really appreciate his participation in this and hear about his perspective and point of view on V6 versus V4 network performance. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Sonny. And I wanted to thank everybody for allowing me to participate remotely by Skype. I am sincerely apologetic for not being able to attend in person. I was very much looking forward to visiting Brisbane, so perhaps next time. So with that, all that said, I'll kind of jump into kind of the material here. So a lot of what you've heard today, you know, we've also explored many of these tests. We have some data that we could also make available offline or even conversationally. But truthfully, the measurement work that we've undertaken here at Comcast originally started off with pretty much you know, some direction from our execs. The instruction to me was, sure, John, go ahead and deploy IPv6, but don't break anything. So, you know, as the good engineer that I am, I said, well, the best way to determine that we haven't broken anything is to really kind of perform measurements and do it well in advance of our rollout. If we've broken something and we've gotten a phone call, it is way too late at that point. Kind of going back to Jeff's example about you know, the equivalent of this, you know, the spinning beach ball of death on Mac. We certainly couldn't tolerate having, you know, millions of customers having a poor experience over V6 and ultimately giving us a call to tell us about it. So what you see here on the second slide is really kind of a summary of what we were after, right? We were after a measurement platform that we could leverage to kind of proactively identify when problems arose, and we certainly, you know, this tool and this work that we've done, it paid for itself many times over. Essentially, we took an approach where we would conduct measurements regionally, and essentially the measurements were from what we would call like service provider, data center equivalent infrastructure. But as you'll see, as we kind of get further into these slides, there's more to come on that front. So what we were trying to do was really kind of simulate customer experience, right? Because and I forget who mentioned it on the panel, but after the day is done, that's really what matters. So from our perspective, there are three key elements that kind of gets rolled up into this concept that we call the experience index or the customer experience index. We have the broadband network, the core network, and basically the internet. The internet block should probably be a little bit bigger, but it is what it is, right? I think you guys all get the idea. We factor all these things in and really try to kind of roll up what we see as the customer experience into almost a single digit. And I won't necessarily elaborate on all that too much today, but certainly could. One of the things that we noticed is that across the broadband ecosystem, that V6 performance in many cases was V6 was outperforming IPv4. So one of the things that set us off on our initial direction was, what exactly are those components that we think are making a bit of a difference? And Sonny, can you still hear me, by the way?
John, can you just hold on for a second, please?
Sure.
Can you still hear us, John?
I certainly can. You sound crystal clear.
That's a lot better. We got some jitter here, so that's all. Please continue.
Okay. Yeah, certainly. So from our perspective, we saw that V6 was outperforming IPv4. And initially, when some of the engineers brought this to my attention years ago, believe it or not, I almost sent them away and said, impossible, cannot be true. And oddly enough, 3, 4, 5 years ago, we didn't do that much kind of exploration on this topic. But the funny thing is it kept popping back up over and over again. So clearly, again, being a good engineer, we said, well, we really should take a closer look at this. And this was right around the same time where we had to really tighten our measurement belt to make sure that we weren't breaking anything. So what did we do? So going back to what you had said earlier, we took data points from a number of different systems, some that we've grown on our own internally, and some that are basically commercial off the shelf. And we were seeing that even based on large sample sizes, I mean, we have over 30% of our broadband network has been actively uses IPv6 today. So 30% of my customers today are provisioned with native dual stack internet, both v4 and v6. And we have a non-trivial amount of traffic. As you saw from some of the earlier slides, some of the largest sample sets originate from the Comcast network in the United States. And we surpassed 1 terabit of traffic just earlier this year. And even when we did some of the statistical kind of, the common things statistically, dropping highs and lows and whatnot, we still found that on average we were finding that V6 was, outperforming IPv4. So what? So why, right? That really pushed us to kind of dig deeper. What we were finding is that, so we broke the problem up into 3 buckets, as you saw on the illustration a few slides earlier. The core network, the broadband network, and the internet, right? So a lot of the core network components, many of the operators in the room, on the internet, and what have you, we all utilize the same equipment from your favorite, network equipment vendor, right? The broadband network, however, is something that's specific, at least in my case, to the cable broadband provider. So there's a smaller subset, and then of course there's the internet, right? Jeff said it best earlier when he said, hey, the test and the infrastructure that Jeff accesses from his office in Australia is certainly not the same for me if I'm going to Google, for example, or Facebook or what have you. So all these things play into some of the things that we were seeing. So we decided to kind of dissect it. One of the things that I've added to this material since since we started to kind of do this work is, as many of you know, there's also been a lot of to-dos lately in the industry around what is the impact of of the growing routing table and on older equipment, and how does that impact performance and stability? And then all in all, what we're also noticing is that the routing tables for IPv6 are remaining relatively same. And this even, we even see this directly and from an operational perspective on our access network. Sonny, you can still hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Lovely. So interesting data, right? So we're finding that this story continues to evolve and kind of is telling us, giving us more and more information to kind of go chase around here. So some of the other things that we're finding, DNS lookup times, CDNs, whether it's the readiness of commercial CDNs or people trying to host their own equipment, their own content. We're finding that that these are all very interesting variables. There are points in time, and I certainly won't contradict anybody, but at least from my perspective, we've had some different observations. We've seen even recently that things are leveling out, but in the early days, we were seeing very specific subsets of content population where the performance for V6 was just hideous. But it wasn't necessarily what I'll say the content owner's fault, right? So we had a lot of government sites, for example, in the U.S. That were just having very poor performance, and we were finding that it was the underlying CDN that was kind of and their readiness for V6 that was the underlying factor there. So the story continues for us. There's definitely some duh moments here on slide number 8. V4 obviously continues to deplete. The fact that we have kind of the routing tables that are ever bloating at this stage of the game, and I don't think any one of us expects that to kind of subside anytime soon. And of course, the appearance of more transition technologies, right? So one of the things that we are after in particular, and this is kind of the crux of some of our measurements, is we're after a proper IPv6 only experience, right? And I think that's something that we've, I think everybody would agree that we've kind of articulated from the earliest stages of our V6 deployment, is that the end game for us is to get to a place where we can run the business and we can support our customers and all of our products and services in an IPv6 only environment. So what is that going to require so that we can avoid some of the penalties that are associated with kind of a degrading V4 world, and that includes transition technologies? Well, that requires content, consumer electronics, and of course broadband to support V6 by default. And I think many of the people in the room familiar with V6 launch would agree that from a broadband point of view, there's been a huge surge in kind of this on by default mantra that we've all embraced as World V6 launch. So now as you kind of take a look at the larger landscape and some of the points that were brought up here today, we've had a lot of technical bits flying around about how V6 may or may not be better, and I'll have some questions for John Berg in particular. And Jeff and I have had this conversation on a number of occasions, and of course I know Eric very well. But as a company, Comcast is starting to look at our V6 deployment and really kind of how and where we take this next. We are seriously talking about V6 only. One of the things that I hope to be able to talk about in the session that's later in the day on your guys' end are some of the services or devices that we're looking to make V6 only, and the fact that these devices may have to reach the V4 internet and they might need help. So what happens when you have a V6 only device, and it has to be V6 only because there's no V4, there's not enough V4? Or what happens when we have to deliver V4 as a service, and maybe the transport for that V4 service is IPv6? Sonny, still good? Still
there. Yep, still good.
Oh wow, you're crystal clear. Yeah. So what's next? So from our perspective, we started our measurements from kind of what I would call our regional networks out to the internet, and really what we're after now is to really deepen those measurements, push them further into the customer's premises, understand really what's affecting the customer's experience. Core to the internet is just not sufficient any longer. I mean, at this stage of the game, I think every one of us can deploy a server in a data center, make sure it's dual stack and that the routing doesn't break. But making sure that the experience remains intact in the home, especially as the kind of the landscape and the properties of what we consider the internet are going to be changing dramatically, whether that's V6 only or V4 service or what have you. And there are a number of things that we've kind of felt firsthand, especially in recent months. A lot of people, probably even Comcast, we took it for granted initially. So, wired versus wireless and other activity within the customer's premises that may be affecting their experience. And maybe some of this has nothing to do with IPv6. Maybe it's just, a teenage kid gaming away and then everybody else in the house wondering why, the internet's slow. So part of our mission here is to really kind of identify, optimization opportunities, right? But in order to do that, we really need to kind of measure and have data. And of course, a huge part of this is to continue our collaboration with folks like Jeff and APNIC and others around the globe, to kind of make sure that we're all doing our part to kind of measure and collaborate. With that, Sonny, I'll turn it back to you or see if there's any questions.
Thank you, John. I've got one for you from operator to operator. So it's been a major change to the environment. So what's the general perception of the service from a customer perspective? So from an engineering perspective, it's very clear we can see the measurements and the performance of the environment. But has there been more calls to help desk, or is it roughly the same after launch?
It was no different. As a matter of fact, some people joke it's almost like maybe they went down, but I think we all realize that that's probably psychology more than science. So from our perspective, we spend a lot of time, Sonny, really kind of measuring and instrumenting our deployment for V6. I'm certainly going to take Jeff up on his offer and figure out those TCP connection numbers that he has for Comcast. That's important to us. We take that very seriously. We don't. We're proud of the fact that our deployment has been seamless so far. We haven't, from our initial deployment 4 years ago up until today, V6 has caused no more phone calls than anything else that we do. As a matter of fact, I'd say it's probably one of the least call generating activities that we've had. But I've certainly had to earn it, to be perfectly honest with you. We've been held to a pretty high standard to kind of make sure that we illustrate that we're not the source of any sort of customer impact.
Thank you, John. Are there any questions on the floor for panels? No. Okay. John, thank you very much for your presentation. We appreciate you coming online on Skype for us today.
Sonny, I have a question for John Berg.
Absolutely.
If there's time.
John?
There's time.
Microphone's there. Yeah. Go ahead, John.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, John, one of the things that you mentioned in your presentation is around V4, V6 performance. One of the questions I had for you is when you introduced the various levels of carrier grade NAT, did you consider port utilization and as well as bandwidth utilization as part of those tests?
Yeah, I think in some of the testing, and we were involved with this a couple of years ago out in the Cable Labs lab, but I think bandwidth utilization, we did varying levels of bandwidth utilization in conjunction with analyzing port consumption. I don't really have the figures for that off the top of my head, or did I prepare for that for this particular presentation? I'd have to dig back in my notes there. Was there something specific you wanted to get at there?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we've observed is when it comes to carrier grade NAT, and we've deployed some version of it for what we're calling our community Wi-Fi offering, right? So basically community Wi-Fi for folks in the room who don't kind of know what it is by that name in your region. It's basically like a free SSID that our customers have access to. We call it Xfinity Wi-Fi. We deployed carrier grade NAT there, and we basically arrived at a 400 port allocation per connected device, and we feel that was pretty that was pretty generous in the sense that very few devices, after based on our analysis, was we're going to really kind of exhaust that 400 port allocation. But we found that in some of the testing that the more bits you try to push through that pool of public addresses, or perhaps the more ports that any given device attempts to burn up, it will absolutely have an effect on other customers. Not just their experience, but also the performance of what it is that you're trying to do on the internet. So I don't know if you're prepared to comment on that, but if you are or not, it will be an interesting dimension to add to as a follow-up to some of the analysis that you've done.
Right, and I believe at the time we really didn't do any wireless testing when we collected those first numbers. It was really wired devices we were looking at. But then we kind of did the math, and when I came up with the 200 number, it was really more of a recommendation based on consumption ratios that we compiled data on, and maybe 400's the right number, maybe 200's the right number, maybe 1,000's the right number, depends on the operator. And it's really a comfort zone that you got to work toward there, right? So.
Well, and I think it's more than that. And Sonny, if you don't mind, one other comment just to follow on to that. For John heading to Eric. Eric, I found it was very interesting that there's an MOU, I think you mentioned, with your government in was it Belgium about the 16 ports for any single IP address?
So it was 16 subscriber per IPv4 address.
16 subscribers. Well, so that still kind of indicates that there's a fixed number of ports that will be allocated to any one subscriber in that model for v4, yes?
Yeah, if you do the math, it's something like 65,000 divided by 16, that must be something like 4,000. 4,000 ports per people. But the MOU, most probably, right? Thank you so much. 4,096, Jeff, is better in math than I'm doing. But we don't allocate all of them, right? So it's not really true. Yeah. Anyway, the dimensioning was done on security reason, because not everyone on the server sides lock the remote port. So keeping the big locks at the NAT or the CGN is useless for the police to identify somebody. Now, with 16 subscriber beyond an IPv4 address, they got other means. In the very worst case, they can basically get warrants for 16 subscriber. It's doable, not for 1,000. And usually you can do correlation, right? Because one access is repeated. And then it was one of those 16 and also one of those 16. If the intersection of those two 16 is one guy, you can get a warrant very easily. And it was the whole reasoning behind. It was not user experience, it was security.
Yeah, one of the things I find intriguing about that one, and I think time will tell as this unfolds, is if that maximum number of subscribers sticks, per IP address, and those service providers continue to find themselves in a situation where they have a pool of v4 addresses that continues to deplete. I assume there will come a day when you'll have a service provider that can no longer add a customer to the network. I'd love to be in the room when that conversation happens. Because
the next step, of course, is to go for the mobile provider. When none of them has got v6 in Belgium, because then they can use very short NAT time, right? The NAT keep a lifetime very short, and hoping that most of the traffic will go natively over v6. That's what we hope. Because but this MOU is flexible, right? If the service provider are running into a wall, of course we change. But currently it's enforced.
Interesting. Thanks, Eric.
Welcome, John.
If I could just flick the conversation just slightly back into performance in 6 again. There is one thing that none of us have mentioned, which I must admit I'm intrigued about, and I'm trying to understand how to measure it. We're doing a lot of work in the DNS to actually introduce security. And one of the side products of that is that the responses are going to get bigger. And they're going to exceed 1,500 octets. We're going to see UDP fragmentation. v4 and v6 handle fragmentation very, very differently. Because in v4, if the packet's too big for the next hop, you're allowed at that point in that router to slice and dice the packet and send the two fragments forward. In V6, you cannot do that. If the packet is too big, you have to send back a message to the originator of the packet saying, try again, make it smaller. So it's kind of the reverse in V4. One of the essential issues that we have in the DNS is, will the DNS still work when V6 happens for transport and we're getting path problems? And that's one bit that we haven't mentioned so far. We've looked at RTTs, we've looked at these issues of connection establishment, but we haven't yet looked at the issue of the handling of fragmentation. And that's certainly something that I'm trying to now have a look at and see if I can actually understand to what extent is the handling of fragmentation in 6 an operational problem even today, or is it okay? And I really don't know the answer, but at some point we're going to need to know. I don't know if any of the others, if you've looked at this, Eric or John.
Hey, Jeff. Go ahead.
John first. Yep, go ahead, John.
Thanks, Sonny. Thank you. So, sorry, Eric. Jeff, we actually did take a look at this about a year and a half ago. Ran some, we developed and ran some automated testing for kind of incrementally increasing MTU, as well as kind of aligning that with varying file sizes. Tried to, I'll spare you the boring details around kind of how we set up some of the tests. But we really do believe that this is one of the areas, and I kind of mentioned this briefly in one of the slides. We see this as an area an opportunity, frankly. We think exactly. We agree with the comment that you made that this is the fact that it's handled exactly the reverse in V6 the way it is in V4 kind of presents a pretty significant problem. In fact, it goes as far as saying maybe it makes path MTU grossly less efficient. And it's an area that not only do we want to explore and continue to measure within the boundaries of our network, as well as to the internet, but we all, and there's a little bit of reality that we have to kind of pepper in there as well, because DOCSIS, and John Burr can kind of confirm this, but from the earliest days of DOCSIS, we've had a 1500 byte MTU. With DOCSIS 3.1, we moved that up to 2000, and then with some of the other advancements that we're looking at in the cable space, we had the potential for much higher. But we do think that we're leaving some performance on the table, so to speak, by not exploring some opportunities in the MTU space.
Eric?
Yeah, I was simply want to say that I think it's at an IETF meeting, the people from Google, you know what I mean by this, John, simply announced they are dropping packets coming with fragmentation header. So I hope they got different tricks, like spling tricks with the MSS. Right.
One question from the floor.
Hi, I'm Paul Vixie. I'm the author of RFC 2671. Turns out fragmentation is a terrible idea, should not have been done, and V6 is exposing all of that. There are a lot of middle boxes now that will drop IP6 frames that have the fragmentation header. So it turns out that it isn't just that you can't fragment in the middle of the path, it's that you can't fragment at the end either, at least if you want reliability. So Jeff's right, this is a huge problem. The solution that we're trending toward is try to keep your entire payload less than 1280 octets long, and that in turn is putting some back pressure on DNSSEC because those signatures want to be bigger than that in many cases. But this is an area of active development, and I apologize for the use of fragmentation.
Well, apology accepted, Paul. What we were trying to do is at least to actually measure to what extent we can observe it as a problem in the internet today by basically carving out ads that stress the MTU issue, and to find out to what extent we can uncover where there are real issues in relaying the ICMP messages. We really don't know at this point how prevalent this is as a problem, and it would be good to get some hard data about to what extent it's out there, or whether it's just more of a theoretical problem than an actual one. And that's where we're trying to put down some data first.
Jeff, could I make one last comment to Paul, please? Or Sonny?
Yeah, go ahead, John, yes.
So Paul, one of the things I wanted to kind of ask you is from our perspective, because DNS and DNSSEC with larger payloads is one thing, but but also from a video point of view, from our perspective, IP video, we certainly believe, and I'll kind of phrase it in that way for now, that that there's value in sending more data in fewer packets. If that can be done, you know, kind of in a reliable way, you know, for IP video and even, you know, DNS. Do you believe that you know, that would be valuable, you know, to you know overall to the performance of these protocols?
This is Paul. I do believe that's valuable, and I believe that in the case of video it will work, because video does not involve a high number of flows. It uses TCP in general, and it has a low enough number of flows that you don't have the setup and teardown cost. So TCP does not need fragmentation. It can simply constrain its segments to that 1280 octet limit. So this really is a specific problem that we're having with DNS because it uses UDP.
Thanks, Paul. Sonny, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Thank you, John. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions on the floor? So really, in conclusion from this panel of today, and thank you everyone for your participation today, it's very much appreciated. There is more research to do, and the statistics are becoming better as the data set grows through more V6 deployments around the world, obviously. And appears to be some performance gains for deploying IPv6 compared to IPv4. We can agree, I think, that NAT slows things down, but I don't know if NAT4.4 actually helps. The results are very strange, John. So it'll be interesting to see what the results will look like in the future as well. So I want to thank all the presenters today for their participation, and John for coming onto Skype to do the presentation as well. Thank you very much. I'll remind everyone to attend the AP IPv6 Task Force meeting and V6 readiness measurement at 5:40 p.m. today in, I think it's in this room. And there's free IPv6 tutorials tomorrow as well at 11 a.m. 2 p.m. 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 2 p.m. tomorrow in the room next door. So please come to those. So at this point, thank you very much to the panel, and thank you to the audience for your participation. And thank you very much.